You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
What number are we thinking of? 69, dudes!
Well, it's 1969, okay. Walk across the USA. It's another year for me and you. Another year with nothing to do. It's another year for me and you. Another year with nothing to do.
これは奇形人間の王様だ。美しい女どもを奴隷にして好き放題に暮らすのだ。正常な赤ん坊や年寄りを集めてきてはこんな奇形人間を創造してきた。ここでは片者は解放されて奇形人間の天国になるのだ。お前たちのようなまともな体のやつには俺の苦しみがわかるものか。世間の白い目、高貴な目、堅固の目、長小軽蔑。俺はそんなことにはびくともしないのだ。いいか、お前たちはもうここから出られない。貴様もだ。みんな奇形人間になるのだ。俺はその日の来るのを待っていた。世界のどこにもないような奇形人間にするためにな。誰だ？お前は一体何者なんだ？私は気違いじゃない。出してくれ。やめてくれ。俺は気違いじゃない。気違いじゃないんだ。やめてくれ。やめろ。私はなぜ、何のためにこんな目に遭わなければならないのか。私自身の出世の秘密か謎を解くために私は裏日本にある孤島へ来た。世界に巻き込まれた男が恐怖怪奇に包まれたあの不気味な孤島で次々に起こる怪奇恐怖ロマン謎果たして謎は。
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Miss Jess Byard.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Mr. Ben Buckingham.
G'day.
Our appreciation of 1969 continues with a look at Teruo Ishii's Horrors of Malformed Men. Based on the writings of Edogawa Ranpo, the movie tells the tale of Hirosuke Hitomi, played by Teruo Yoshida. When we first see him, he's locked up in an insane asylum, and things only go downhill from there. We will be spoiling this movie, so if you haven't seen it before, please stop the podcast and go watch it. We will still be here. So, Ben, when was the first time you saw Horrors of Malformed Men, and what did you think?
I was trying to remember where I first came across this, because it's just kind of a film that I feel like I've always been aware of. While I was doing some of the research, I found that the first international reference to discussion of it was in the Phil Hardy's Encyclopedia of Horror. And I was like, oh, yep, that would have been where I heard of it. And then you read the title, Horrors of Malformed Men, and you go, yes, add to watch list immediately, and then spend almost 20 years trying to find it. I think I would have bought the Synapse DVD, which was also the first, definitely the first international release. I think it might have been the first DVD release altogether. That'd be the North American release service by Synapse. I'm pretty sure I ordered that and then watched it and then showed a bunch of people and then screened it at my back of a bar film night and traumatized a whole bunch of people. And then not long after they did the first Ishii retrospective at the Undine Festival in Italy, they screened that 35mm print of Horrors of Malformed Men here in Melbourne at the Melbourne International Film Festival. So I sort of have come at it from multiple angles, all of which have been intriguing and unusual ways to see it, which, given its sort of history of not being very widely seen, is kind of the opposite of most people's experience.
How about you, Jess?
I first came across this movie when I was in high school and a part of these old Netflix forums that don't exist anymore. But that was pretty much where I spent most of my formative years, making list after list after list of crazy horror or exploitation or sci-fi or anything sort of adjacent to any of those genres. And again, I put it on my to-watch list, and then I just hadn't seen it until I watched it for this podcast. So, I first watched it for this podcast, and I'm really glad that I did. I watched it on a Blu-ray. Actually, it was kind of funny. My husband purchased me the Arrow Blu-ray release of this for Christmas because he went on my wish list and I had thrown it in there recently, and he was like, yeah, it was at the top of your list, so I thought you wanted it really bad. And I was like, well, yeah, I totally do, because I want to watch that version for the projection booth. So yeah, this Blu-ray really delivers, and I'm glad that I finally got to knock this film off my list. And I definitely want to watch more of Ishii's repertoire, which I understand is even harder to find.
Yes and no. There are a lot of things out there, but he is, if not as prolific as Miike, probably pretty darn close. I mean, the guy put out so many movies. It's just crazy. I want to say that he had at least 3 movies this year, if not 4 in 1969. So he was just cranking them out, man. And to the point too, where a lot of the titles just start to run together, because he would also do a lot of series. So there's like the Line series, and just the whole Joy of Torture, I think, is one of his series and stuff. So he was just making buku movies, so it's kind of tough to keep up with them. But yeah, to your point also, you can't really find very many good copies of this stuff. And Horrors of Malformed Men was a movie that I came across the title probably on Tom Fitzgerald's infamous Pimpedelic Wonderland list of hard to find or impossible to find movies, because for a lot of years you could not get this movie at all, whether you were in the States or in Japan. And there were a lot of theories as far as why is that? Was there something really incredibly objectionable in here? What was the story with this movie? Why was this movie essentially banned for all these years? And I think a lot of it has to do with the idea of malformed people. That malformed is the original word in Japanese apparently is very offensive. So it'd be like calling this a movie about like the R word, or just like really awful American words, English words. And also when you think about when this came out and the history of Japan, and just that there were probably some quote unquote malformed people around due to either war injuries or radiation from Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that this was probably speaking a little bit to that too. So I think that people look down upon that whole idea of these mutant creatures that they have in the film.
Yeah, no, it was released on Halloween in 1969, so they were definitely leaning into the horrific element of it when they released it. But from what I understand, he had the full support of Toei Studios. and that they even though it was pulled, and it was pulled from circulation not long after release, and it never received a home video or DVD release until this century, it still did do screenings, like midnight screenings and such. So it wasn't entirely a banned film. It was kind of kept up the sleeve as something to pull out every now and then and draw a crowd, and it had its admirers, but obviously that was very localized to Japan and a small handful of cinemas.
And I can see this being, especially in 1969, and I mean, Japanese culture is a very conservative and reserved culture. There's a lot of sort of perversion and sex associated in this movie with this movie. You know, the island itself is sort of this fantasy island type resort, if I guess for our lead character's pseudo father. It's his sort of just playground and a place where he can act out and be as him and is involved in this stuff as he wants to be, sort of outside of the purview and watchful eye of the family and everyone outside of the family. So I can see this being a very sort of shock to the system for Japanese film boards and general, you know, just like here or just like in the UK with the video nasties, or just like here with censorship and, you know, Hays Code, things like that. It's all just sort of a mix of conflicting ideals, I guess.
It reminds me of Texas Chainsaw Massacre in a number of ways, but I think it's just that, in some ways, it's just the title. It's a kind of like, if Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if it had been called anything else, it wouldn't have stirred up nearly as much controversy as it did. But it's just that impact of that title, Horrors of Malformed Men, just immediately things you go, ugh.
It's funny you said that, because as I was watching this, and our main character sort of assumes the identity here, I was just picturing, like, he essentially assumes the identity to the worst family you could assume your identity to, next to the family in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, if you just, like, tried to come in and be like, yeah, I'm gonna inherit this meat farm and everything's gonna be great. Oh, crap, they're cannibals. All right.
So they do have the ero-guro genre, the erotic grotesque, that it does grow out of the traditions of shunga art, which is there's erotic art. It was labeled as hentai, being obscene, and it was theoretically banned, but it was still prevalent and everywhere through the 19th century, and it only really started to get locked down, and it was only really fully banned when they started to integrate more with the West. And it's that classic thing of, we don't want to present ourselves as being this. You know, Australia had the same thing in the 70s, where it's like, we wanted to present Picnic at Hanging Rock, we didn't want to present Turkey Shoot. Shunga was the Ozploitation of Japan in the 19th century. So that's, very much where the ero-guro comes from. And Edogawa Ranpo is tapping into those traditions and combining them with Western traditions. And so in a way, it is kind of pushing back against this nationalistic, jingoistic culture that is developing, that is starting to close itself off, even as it's embracing the West.
And we should probably note that this, the full title of this movie isn't just Horrors of Malformed Men, that it's like collected works of Edogawa Ranpo, because they are pulling not just from one story when it comes to Ranpo, but a whole bunch. I think I counted like 6 different stories that there are bits and pieces matched up to this. There's a lot to do with the Strange Tale of Panorama Island, but there are other bits and pieces. There's even a little bit of like his story of the human chair that's mixed in here. There's things about twins, and this just kind of mixes and matches all of these different bits of his stories and puts them all into one stew. And I think that's one of the reasons too why this movie feels slightly disjointed at times, because we start in this insane asylum. We move out of the asylum. We have this whole weird, like, North by Northwest scene where he's holding the knife that stabs this woman that he just meets, and he's there. And I'm surprised the photographer didn't come up and take his picture right then. then there's the part that we were talking about him assuming an identity and becoming part of this other family. And then the movie takes a left turn again and ends up going to this island that the father of the family has. It's a little bit scattershot, but I think just because it's all presented in the same tone and stitched together through the editing, that this doesn't feel like you are taking 6 different stories and just kind of cramming them together. It actually feels like this whole thing is cohesive to me.
I did not read all of the various stories that you found in this. I did start reading Panorama Island. I think I'm about halfway through it. And I think that probably the majority of this plot is taken from that one. Like just the biggest plot points being the island itself, the assuming identity. Again, it's also it's very different, I think, from this movie, because I don't know if you guys felt the same way, but, or if you got to read any of Panorama Island, but the lead character in Panorama Island is a lot less likable than the one in Malformed Men, and not that the one in Malformed Men is particularly great. I mean, he's not really terrible. We don't really know him to do anything bad. We don't really know why he's in the institution to begin with. The worst thing he does is obviously assume the identity of this dead man. Turns out it doesn't really matter, but in Panorama Island, he's a much more, I think, deceptive and out for himself kind of character, where in Malformed Men, he sort of takes a turn because once he realizes what's going on, he wants to help the family, and sort of his father's weird experimentation.
I didn't get a chance to read any of the stories, but I think in the book form, it's a bit easier to juggle these multiple elements, whereas the film is already so overloaded and full of such dramatic characters and such that simplifying that main character to very much make him our access point into all of this works in the film's favor, and he is very much that blank slate. The way that it opens, you mentioned North by Northwest, but it felt very noir-like to me, which Ishii had made a number of very Western-influenced noirs previous to this, and I watched one of Ishii's noirs, Flesh Pier, and it reminded me a lot of Jules Dassin's work in that it's very location-based and very real and dealing with a lot of things that American noir wasn't dealing with. And that opening, especially with the voiceover narration, it has that feel of a noir, not just in that, the tropes of noir and the voiceover, et cetera, mystery man, forgot amnesia, all that kind of stuff. But that feeling that the narration feels like a thread that's already pulling him forward. The destination is kind of inevitable, even though we have absolutely no idea how we're going to get there or where it is or how many twists and turns it's going to take to get there. It feels like the thread has already got him and he's already doomed to whatever is going to happen at the end, just like most leads in noirs.
Yeah, the voiceover, the mysterious bald man in the asylum who wants to kill him, the lullaby that he thinks that he can hear, the images of the cliffs that he draws out, just all of this stuff. It's like, okay, who is this person? And I think that the actor that plays him does a really great job because he becomes that. And I think you pretty much said the exact same thing, Jess. He becomes like the normalcy in this insane world. He plays it so straight. He never goes off the rails like so many of these other characters do, especially the father character who just, from the moment that you see him, he is just 100% wild and even has like mad monkey noises coming out of his mouth and stuff. So it's just like, wow. So he is the complete opposite of who ends up being his father.
Noir feelings for sure, and that's coming. I would say from the Ranpo was a mystery writer, but this is some of this is not your American noir, not at all. I mean, the second we see his father, like that minute where we're introduced to him and he's doing his interpretive dance on the cliffs and running through the water, is legitimately unsettling. It legitimately just it's funny, and there's a lot of unexpected humor in this movie that works and is also just kind of, it's pleasant, silly. And yeah, our lead character just being the constant straight man in this world that just gets getting even more absurd. But yeah, his father really, that actor and the movement that he does. I mean, it's not just that scene. Anytime this actor is on screen, he's doing some kind of strange, fidgeting or dancing or whatever you want to call it. And it makes my skin crawl. It really does. It's entertaining to watch, but I also kind of want to look away. And there were a couple moments, I think, here that, as a horror fan and having these movies that are on these lists forever that I have, checking them off is just kind of like it's a very accomplished feeling. But I'm always looking for the horror elements in them and why would they be on these lists? And his character alone and, a scene later on in the movie when we're kind of getting the main exposition as to the past and the connections that all these characters have. There's a scene where there's a lot of crabs crawling all over a corpse, and I had to look away. I had to look away for a couple seconds because it was hard to watch. And this also comes from the era of film that I'm never entirely sure if animal violence is real or not.
That snake definitely was real. It's such a staple. Like, I watch a lot of Italian cinema, and it's like if an animal appears in an Italian film, it's like that animal's going to die. And it's very much the same with Japanese and Chinese cinema as well.
Italian cannibal movies were influenced, I think, by this or by films like this, because when they arrive at the island and we get to see all of the sort of creations that the leader has made, I got a lot of Cannibal Holocaust feels and a lot of seeing all of those people just writhing around. I couldn't take the scene out of my mind in Cannibal Holocaust when they're getting ready to destroy that girl, and I was waiting for something like that to happen in this movie. It did not, but I can definitely see a lot of that influence in there.
As a big cannibal fan, I was sitting there wondering, does it count as cannibalism if you eat crabs that have just eaten your boyfriend?
Exactly. No, I feel like maybe tangentially, yes.
That was something I was thinking about a lot as well, because it really just didn't travel as far as I could tell. Like, I don't know if people overseas or other like filmmakers and such, but you could definitely, there's so many strong connections. I mean, like, even with like such works like Jodorowsky, El Topo was being made at about the same time, released in 1970. There's a lot of commonalities with El Topo and Holy Mountain. Of the Italian directors, I would definitely consider that Ishii and Edogawa Ranpo probably are the most akin to each other, both working in the same kinds of extremities and coming from a very sort of grounded, earthy background, but willing to take extremely bizarre flights of fancy. I would love to know what Ishii was reading, because a lot of this reminded me of the theatre of cruelty and the works relating to that, which I know that Jodorowsky was definitely drawing on, and Deodato would have been aware of. And, even Fulci as well, when you look at some of, like, watching Japanese Hell, Jigoko, one of Ishii's later films, there's a lot of similarities with The Beyond in his depictions of hell. Obviously, that's a long time after The Beyond's made, 20 years. But it's still, you can feel that they're all kind of tracing back more to these manifestos and theories and attempts to try and push the art form into different directions. And Ishii he was very much about that, trying to explore new things and new ways of presenting ideas in cinema. And, his earliest successes were the Starman series, which I haven't seen any of, but they essentially start a whole series of sci-fi films that start the, superheroes in cod pieces and ridiculous outfits like the Inframan and all that kind of stuff. And Ishii basically started that subgenre, which, still continues to this day in Japan and throughout the world. And so he was very iconoclastic in where he was willing to go. And, he came to doing those Starman films after working with some of the most respected Japanese filmmakers who are, the kind of people that get played at Cinematheques now, whereas Ishii is still largely ignored. So his influences are pretty diverse, but he was really unafraid to just go out there and get in the mix and explore and try new things. And that really pissed off a lot of people that he was very unpopular at Toei. There was actually, I think it was a group of 20 or something, assistant directors got together and signed a petition to have him fired from Toei and never to work with them again, because they considered his torture films and his horror films to be bringing about the end of cinema. Yep, we've been talking about the end of cinema for a long time. In listening to some of the audio commentaries that are on that Arrow disc, I think it was Mark Schilling who met with Ishii and had organised the retrospective in Italy. He's described him as playful. He said that was absolutely like the one word that he would most use to describe Ishii, that he was incredibly playful, and he just had this energy, and I think that's what you're saying, Jess, about the humor in the film, that unlike a lot of Asian cinema where the humor is a bit sort of on the nose or slapsticky, it's like the humor here does feel a bit more organic. And even though it is like his films are quite nightmarish and horrifying, you can feel that kind of like that it's coming from an actual person, that kind of sort of bit of a punk, playful personality, which much like Deodato like has that kind of personality when you listen to him talk. And yeah, absolutely. The more of his films you see, you're like, oh yeah, even, watching his films from the last, in his 70s, there's still that incredible energy and that playfulness there, and just the obsessiveness with cinema that he had. And that, Schilling says that even running around the film festival in Italy, he still had a camcorder with him and was recording everything, that he just loved looking at things through a camera. And I think, like, I always think of that as having like a kino eye disorder, where it's just like you're born with it, where you're just born with a kino eye and you can't escape it, and you just have to make films no matter what.
I was watching a featurette on the Blu-ray, and it was just various directors talking about their introduction to Ishii and later on meeting him and everything. And the one part they was showing him of a video of him where he was like down on his hands and knees, and he was probably like 80 some years old. And they're like, yeah, he's 80 some years old and he's still making short, independent films. I'm like, man, I hope that I'm that kind of 80-year-old. I hope that I still have the will and the energy and just the ability to keep myself going and doing something that I love for that long. 'Cause yeah, it comes through. This movie, it's a creepy movie. It's an interesting movie. It's a funny movie. And I think that like all really, all good movies, it sort of go above genre. They just they fit into everything. They can be, you can place different references and different inspirations and everything to them. And I think that Ishii, being as prolific as he was, and like I said, this is the only film of his that I've seen. And looking at IMDb, yeah, like Mike, you said, it's crazy. It's seeing 5-6 movies he's directed in one, in 1968. That's insanity that you can direct that many movies in 1 year.
He liked to shoot quick. He liked to have a professional crew that knew what they were doing and wouldn't question him. And so he could just keep it moving and he could fly through it. And apparently he had great confidence in his ability as an editor, and he knew that he would be able to get enough that he could make it work in post. And so he wasn't afraid of like, oh, we need to set up for this, we need to set up for that. It was like, turn up, see what it looks like, work with it, engage with it, keep moving, keep shooting. So that definitely is part of what helped with that speed of getting it made. And I think, someone like Takashi Miike is very much like that. And another filmmaker who I think is definitely inspired by Ishii, Gaspar Noé. I think he returned definitely on his best form when he made Climax, which he went for that same kind of feel where they shot that in 17 days or something. And so I think that definitely helps propel that kind of anarchic energy if you're just really flying through it. And even like we were talking about the father played by Tatsumi Hijikata. Now he's the founder of the Buto dance movement, which is a avant-garde Japanese dance movement that was specifically designed to try and take dance back from Western influences and to create a specifically Japanese dance, the modern Japanese dance, one that was very invested in the body and breaking down boundaries and confronting taboos. When they went to those, you talked about that amazing introduction of his character when he's on those rocks and his body's just twisting and moving and everything. They just went to that location and Tatsumi just started climbing over the rocks and just exploring. And they were just like, oh God, he's going to die. It's like, yeah. And apparently he was quite ill at the time as well, but he got to that space and was just so invigorated by the environment that Tatsumi just had to leap into there and just leap into the water and dig in. And so you can definitely understand why they worked so well together, because they had that kind of connection of being able to just look at a space and find the inspiration for it.
You were talking about the theater of cruelty, and I think that Budo and the theater of cruelty would go hand in hand, one on one side of the world and one on the other. And that they use so many of the Budo dancers for the people that are on the island, I thought was a really smart thing to do.
Everybody that's not supposed to just be a regular, normal person visiting the island has an interesting movement to it, and it's a constant movement. Every scene, everyone aside from your main character and the travel companions, who I guess are probably the not quite as interesting part of this movie. For the most part, they just kind of hang out in the background later on. But yeah, it's having them as dancers and having that just sort of, again, more energy in each scene is great, because it keeps every scene lively. Even if you're watching basically a scene of exposition, of which there are a lot in this movie, but it's, I don't think, a hindrance to it.
I pulled this great quote from Antonin Artaud's Theatre of Cruelty manifesto. There can be no spectacle without an element of cruelty as the basis of every show. In our present degenerative state, metaphysics must be made to enter the mind through the body. So this film does that entirely, and the Buto dance movement 100%. That body horror that just unsettles you, and the aesthetic of it as well, that it's sort of, you don't know what exactly you're being presented with when you see these people. The combination of the way that they're moving their body and also the costumes and makeup. It's like, is that makeup meant to look dodgy and cheap, or is it beyond, it's so horrifying and demented that I can't comprehend what it is? And your brain just kind of keeps switching backwards and forwards between these two modes, and it totally displaces you. Which is, definitely what Theatre of Cruelty is meant to do. It's meant to displace you and make you start to engage and actually think about it and really dig into it. And I think that's a lot of there's this very strange sense of morality in Ishii's films. And I think the way is not necessarily to moralize, to say something is necessarily good or bad, but that he is absolutely willing to press you up against the glass of something dangerous to make you consider your own boundaries and what you think is right or proper. And yeah, I think that's part of why this film definitely has that impact, because it doesn't let its audience off the hook at any point.
If you haven't seen this movie, which I highly encourage you to do, think about more modern J-horror kind of stuff. The Grudge, The Ring, Cairo, each one of those have been influenced by this Buto dance style. So the whole idea of, I can't remember the character's name, but the little dead girl in The Ring, her and her
Samara.
movements, thank you, Samara, coming out of the TV and just the way that she moves, that is totally that Buto style of movement that we're seeing. And just, you can feel that as you watch this film and see the way that these characters move, and you go, oh, okay, now I see the influence of that so many years later, because that was, like you were saying, Ben, it was a post-war kind of movement, and it carries through even today. And you're right about the makeup effects, like the whole idea of the people who are merged with like the goats or the twin, where it's the beautiful girl and then the hideous creature. The hideous creature looks like it just stepped right out of The Incredibly Strange Creatures Who Stopped Living and Became Mixed Up Zombies.
It does, yeah.
And what about the rice-headed person in the cage? Has somebody stuck their head in a thing of rice and they've just come out as like a ball of rice now, and are they eating themselves? Is somebody else eating? Is that even rice? What the? The film is, about 100 minutes long, and you don't get to the island until about halfway through, and then you are just slammed for about 20 minutes with a cavalcade of what the fuck? Compress Holy Mountain into 20 minutes, and you've got something of an idea of what you get as soon as you arrive on the island.
You were talking about noir and this whole idea of our main character taking over the life of another character who's died. I mean, that has happened so many times in different noir films, or especially like, quote unquote, the sheriff is showing up and we don't know what he looks like, but Willem Dafoe is going to assume that it's him. Or the hitman, we don't know what he looks like, and so we're going to assume that it's Nicolas Cage in Red Rock West or something. So it's just that whole idea is a pretty common trope as well. But I do like in this one, it's this idea of he's not necessarily doing it to solve a mystery. He is solving a mystery of sorts, but a lot of it is because he's on the run because he's now the wrong man. He's the Alfred Hitchcock wrong man. And he just so happens to have the same manji / swastika birthmark on his foot as this other guy who he finds out is dead in the papers. And
what a terrible birthmark.
Yeah, terrible birthmark. Imagine leaving your footprints on the sand with that.
Just,
but I love that whole thing of him then trying to impersonate the dead man, and again that voiceover going when he's just like, "Oh shit, he's left-handed. I almost made a mistake."
It's so much fun going through those scenes. It has this just like a weird, delightful kind of energy, and in that stuff it reminds me of a lot of Seven Deaths in a Cat's Eye, the Antonio Margheriti film, which is much like this film, a bit of a mashup of a whole bunch of Edgar Allan Poe stories, sort of filtered through a Euro-Gothic giallo. That has a similar kind of sort of playful gleefulness to it. Arthur Conan Doyle was a big influence on Edogawa Ranpo, and he created his own Sherlock Holmes-esque character with Kogoro Akachi, who is in this film sort of briefly. And, that seems to be a very Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes-esque, but you must remember that Edgar Allan Poe is actually the creator of the detective novel that he's considered to have written the first detective story. And so even that is much more of an Edgar Allan Poe element. And I remember that in reading this, that when they wrote about it in the Encyclopedia of Horror in the 80s, that they incorrectly described this as being an adaptation of Island of Dr. Moreau, which, you can see those flavors in there, but it's not especially so, and it really does have a lot more in common with William Wilson, which is Edgar Allan Poe's story of a doppelganger. And there are numerous doppelgangers in this film and doubles, and it very much ties it in with Poe's interest in the uncanny, the unheimlich, that which is home but not home, which this whole film is just like everything is uncanny in this film.
Yeah, because not only is our main character, our main actor, playing two roles, but also the woman that he stabs or someone stabs and he gets blamed for, she will show up later on as one of these two twins as well, I believe. So we've got characters that are playing multiple roles, which is nice. And then, having the twin characters.
Talking lots about sort of historical antecedents. How about prefiguring incels? Especially when you start to go into other Ranpo works like Blind Beast. It's like, this is all sounding quite familiar to a lot of our current discussion of psychotic males.
Like Jess was saying, the Hitomi of the story is much more of an otaku-type incel character, where he just sits around and fantasizes all day about this world that he wants to create, and he's got journals that are just filled with drawings and ideas and thoughts, and he ends up going to this island after he takes the place of this other person who is his exact double, but they have nothing. As far as I remember in the story, they are not related. That just happens to be a double that he met at college, and he can pass for him. And he ends up going to the island and spending the fortunes of this family to make this beautiful island of all of his desires.
Yeah, there's no father figure that's like controlling all of this. It's he goes in there and is basically just like, yep, fuck your family. I'm taking your money.
And there's this whole weird thing where he's afraid to fall in love with the dead man's wife. And at one point, the wife finds out. And I want to say she finds out because he might have a bigger dick than the dead man. Does that sound about right?
I believe that is correct, yes.
But they don't come out and say that
Which,
in so
honestly,
many words.
I thought that they were going to do that in the movie because there's when he is first, introducing himself to the family, and later on that night he's laying in bed and she, wants to sleep with him, but he's like, I don't know if this is a good idea because this could ruin it all. And I was kind of like, are you trying to insinuate something here that like, what? And so, yeah, in the story is because he's bigger than her first husband. So we don't go there in the movie, but yeah, it's much more of a power complex in the, story in Panorama Island than it is in the movie, at least for the main character.
That's actually really fascinating because one of the things that reminded me of Texas Chainsaw Massacre with this is the idea of our elders using us and objectifying, younger generation and, essentially cannibalizing us for their own needs, which makes a lot of sense in regards to the transitions that Japan had been going through. And I had to assume that would be the same in the story because, as I said earlier, the period in which Ranpo was writing was a time in which, the conservative, much like, 100 years ago, pretty much exactly, the conservative powers were on the rise. And there was much more of a closing off of society and the elders trying to put the youth in their place. These Western influences that the youth were embracing was going to destroy Japanese society. And that, someone like Ranpo was going to cause, the perversion and degradation of their morals and all this kind of thing. And it's just like, again, it's like 100 years ago, millennials were destroying everything.
Right.
Yeah, it's the same old story. And that would match as far as adapting. That's quite clever for him to switch it around like that because in a way it illustrates more of what Ranpo was experiencing in his time as a young person working in these fields, that he was being for, that they did pass censorship laws which caused him to no longer be able to write the stories that he wrote, and he ended up writing a lot of sort of like Hardy Boys style books, which is what a lot of like Ishii and such grew up on. And so his period of the sort of really grotesque nightmarish stuff is actually quite small because he was just outright shut down. And so I think the film represents that it is the older generations, the older structures, the old traditions are represented as monstrous and destructive and controlling, even though they represent themselves as being outside. Again, commonalities with our contemporary era. You have this rich, powerful male who is in charge of the family in the area, who is portraying himself as a victim, who has to get his vengeance against the world by committing atrocities against people. And it's just like, it's when you look then at Japan was then taken to war by its elders, in the name of nationality and nationalism and everything. It's quite a striking series of connections, and it really, I think it elevates the film when you start to really dig down into that. I found myself going down so many different rabbit holes as I was investigating this film, because there's just so many different ways of reading it that not only applies to Japanese culture, but as I said, if you watch it now and it's like, oh, this is, I can see commonalities.
Yeah, and our main character being a detective of sorts and trying to dig through and figure out what's going on with this family once he infiltrates it, when he finds the old woman in the attic, and it's just like, okay, what the hell's going on here? It feels like there are politics that he is unaware of between the, I don't know, what would you call this character? He's like the person that takes care of the finances for the family. He seems to be the steward. Thank you. Yeah, he seems to have some things going on. And then also there are all these women that live in the household, and it seems like he was having an affair with one of the maids So now he has to balance out the wife versus the maid and, continue on with this affair so it feels like he's the same person as he was before, because everybody's so suspicious of him. The maid is like, you don't talk to me the same way anymore. You barely look at me. And it's like, well, I didn't know I was supposed to look at you.
Yeah,
Sorry, my bad.
he certainly discovers how it's not easy walking a mile in another man's shoes, literally, in this, because he's just got women throwing himself left, right, and center, and so many things he's got to keep on his toes constantly.
And I mean, I think that definitely goes hand in hand with what you were saying about elders sort of controlling the youth and making them basically puppets in their game. And that's essentially what happens here. Is he comes in, and on one hand, he thinks that he has the control because he's the one who's assumed the identity and is now, whatever his intentions are, wants to complete them. And then suddenly he finds himself assuming the identity, but also assuming all the burden and assuming all the responsibility and assuming all of just everything that goes along with that character's life. And I think that's how probably a lot of youth feel. I mean, I guess I am a youth, and I often feel that way, in that I'm just like here to just replace the other people that were here before me to do this job, to keep things going for the people above me, older than me, so that they can maintain their, way of life and status of living, regardless of how it impacts me or my future or anything like that. So yeah, I definitely I think that this movie is very relevant to now. And yeah, I think a lot of us have been the unsuspecting, like, all right, I got this new opportunity. Everything's going to go great. Oh, crap. Now I have so much more responsibility and so many more things that I was not counting on. And do I even want this anymore?
The film consistently represents careers as a trap, because we find out that he was the younger brother who was sent away to become a surgeon in order to master the art of deforming people. So his whole life, he didn't. Well, for various reasons, which I'm still not entirely clear on, because that was when it starts to really just go exposition. But yeah, his life is predetermined by his father, and he has no choice in it. And only his amnesia has prevented him from being aware of that. But then also when the detective turns up and does his massive exposition dump, we find out that many of the people, specifically the women on the island, were entrapped through advertisements for a job. And that, so you've also got that they went there to have a career, to have a job, to have freedom, to have something which many women hadn't had up until, this period in Japanese culture, and for it to be a trap that they are then just captured and taken to the island and made into slaves and deformed. The whole film represents these different aspects of society as just being like, on the surface, you can look at this film and see just a lot of exploitation and, nastiness and such, but it's actually that it's doing that classic thing that exploitation always did, that it was willing to push up against boundaries and borders that mainstream wasn't willing to address and talk about. And that it is really progressive in these unusual ways, in that it doesn't ever really judge any of the characters. And I think Ishii, maybe when you watch something like Japanese Hell, I think maybe Ishii shifted a bit in how he perceived the characters later. But the morality of the film is to just not mess with other people, to just kind of
don't be an asshole and do your own thing.
Don't be an asshole. And actually, I was thinking, Mike, I think this is the first film you've had me on to talk about that has a happy ending.
Right?
Yeah.
Because you can consider that a happy ending.
Well, I was thinking, it's because...
Hey, it made me laugh.
Edogawa learns the errors of his ways. The father, he goes, I was wrong, and, releases the wife, and they make amends, and the couple end up together happily ever after, as long as they live, which is not very long. And as far as we know, people get to go back to whatever. So compared to all of the other films you've had me on, this was a happy ending.
Immortan Joe died, and Furiosa becomes the leader of the Citadel.
Yeah.
I think that's a happy ending.
I guess, yeah, that's true. Okay, so Bad Batch was slightly happier than this one.
I don't know if this is just a shorthand, but I've noticed that this movie has a lot of use of newspaper and then even like ticker tape headlines as being exposition ways also to move the story along. As soon as something seems like it's going to be dull, it's like you read a newspaper and all of a sudden it's like, oh, hey, your identical twin died. Now it's time to do that. Or when he, quote unquote, murders the girl at the circus, we have the big headlines that look like they're going across Times Square. So it's kind of a nice little trope that we have to just hurry up and move this story along as well. I mean, he is jamming so much stuff into this 80-minute something movie. It's kind of wild.
I mean, I like that aspect of it too, because it goes along with the noir style and sort of Hitchcock style 40s movies of just that. Yeah, we need to announce something or we need to move the plot along here really quick. So let's do a spinning newspaper right now. Boom, boom, boom. There it is. And that I love that. I miss that in movies. I wish we would go back to that sometimes.
And there's that weird moment too. I just want to call it out because it really threw me the first time I saw this film, which is he doesn't escape from the insane asylum. He just kind of walks out of the asylum. There really is no escape.
Michael Myers is his way out of the asylum.
He meets the one girl who's singing the lullaby, and then right around the 13 or 14 minute mark, we fade to black, and then we fade up, and then it's the circus, and he's still with the girl, or the girl was part of the circus, and then he shows up and he's got a beard. And it's like, was this shot later on, or what is going on with this? But then the next time we see him, he's got an eye patch on. And then I'm like, okay, well, at least with the eye patch, I understand that he's trying to hide his identity now that he's a murderer. But I don't know where the beard came from. And I don't know how much time passed between when he escaped the asylum and when the circus is. But it's just like, it really threw me the first time I saw it.
The timeline is a little muddy for like the first half of the movie, because there is just kind of trying to get main character, trying to get him to where we need him to be on the island. And yeah, I was a little thrown off by that too. I thought that time had passed, but then like you said, like, I think maybe he just had the beard for the circus, and then he was like, all right, I'm leaving and I gotta impress these people, so I'll shave my face. Which I think maybe if he's supposed to be looking at, pretty identical to that guy, he's got to take the beard off, which makes, that would make sense. I also kind of feel like that, and I don't know if it's just because I have been watching a lot of Lynch recently, but that sequence where he, leaves the mental institution and bumps into that girl, she's just walking down the street singing that lullaby at night. And then into the circus did just kind of have a Lynch flavor to it to me. I'm not sure at all if Lynch would have been watching anything like this then, which, I mean, I feel like maybe he would have. But yeah, I don't know. It kind of reminded me of Twin Peaks The Return, the infamous Got a Light episode with the teenagers. It just reminded me of the beginning of that, where they're walking through just down the street in the dark. I just kind of had similar feelings towards it.
I've got this note here, and I didn't note who actually said it. I think it's the detective talks about episodic memory, and I think the film takes that structure to heart, that it is this sort of episodic memory as you're coming out of his kind of fugue state in the asylum, and that it's fragmented as if he's being drugged. And in some ways, again, there's so many, like, yeah, you get so many, like, cultural kind of resonances, because it's a bit 12 Monkeys, like, as in, like, which is he, past, present, where is he, who is he, that kind of thing. But also the beard, like, I love seeing this on Blu-ray for the first time, and it's so obvious how many of the beards are fake, because you can see the little plugs. And so we've talked a lot about on directors, filmmakers who love to draw attention to artifice to really sort of, disrupt the audience. And I honestly, I don't think Ishii likes to draw attention to artifice, but I don't think he's at all afraid or concerned about it. Because, like, for instance, one of the monks, when they find his resurrected body, has a bald head, which is very clearly a fake bald head, because you can see it sticking out the back of his collar.
I know some people actually dislike those monks, and I thought that little bit of comic relief was absolutely appropriate for this movie.
Oh, yeah,
Weekend at
absolutely.
Bernie's. Full Weekend at Bernie's moment. Loved it. Always down for a Weekend at Bernie's moment. And what's the line? I wrote it down. If it wasn't for quack doctors like you, half the dead people would be alive today. But there is these moments where you're like, it's much like with the deformities of the people on the island, it's like, is it meant to look not real? Like, yeah, I is looking at the Blu-ray, it looks like he's got himself a fake beard and mustache. And so I didn't read that at all as him having grown it. But then I did think that, like, yeah, he does get rid of it immediately afterwards. So, of course, he gets caught, stabbing the girl, quotation marks, stabbing the girl. And it's like, oh, shit, blew my disguise, like, day one. What am I going to do now? When you go to the thing, something like, Blind Beast versus Killer Dwarf with very low budget and people attacking it for that kind of thing. And it's like, no, I think Ishii's just unconcerned. Like, it's not, and if you do look at those Starman films that he was making with the big, silly spectacle and also just the roots that this sort of stuff has to the Grand Guignol as well, where it's not necessarily presented as a reality, that's more about the impact and the effect of it that it has on you. And I think if people are like, it's that classic thing where people go, oh, it doesn't look real. And it's like, yeah, screw reality. It's uninteresting. This adds for so much more complication because you do end up going, did he grow that beard? Is it a fake beard? How long has it passed? What's going on here? Is the monk a fake monk as well? Is he pretending to have? Because then the monk's like sleeping with the steward's missus as well. And it's just like, there's all sorts of corruptions and misdeeds going on that you really don't have any idea of who is being who or in relation to who. And it just, again, like I said, it displaces you so much that you can never settle comfortably into the film. And I mean that in a good way, in a very good way.
Yeah, the introduction of the guy who will end up being the detective later on. It's like, okay, well, who is this guy and why are they spending so much time introducing this character that he comes out and, oh, that was me who was tending the fire, who made the fire for the girl who almost got attacked by snakes.
I love that he's actually the only true good guy in the entire thing, and he's the dodgiest character in the whole thing. Like, as soon as he appears, you're like, oh, that dude's up to no good. Whereas everybody else, you're like, oh, what's going on? But he's like, nah, he's up to something.
Oh, yeah. There's a moment in here where there's someone in an attic and they're putting poison down a thread into somebody's mouth.
Goes point blank.
Thank you, because I know that I'd seen that before. Yeah, I couldn't remember where I'd seen it.
Yeah, it's the hit that John Cusack stuffs up in Gross Point Blank.
I mean, I've seen other ones where it's like, oh, here's a spider that's going to show up, or a snake, or something. But yeah, I was just like, where have I seen this poison down a thread before? Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, because we have to get rid of the wife in order for him to finally be with his one true love, who ends up being his sister. So maybe this is an influence on George Lucas as well.
It's funny you should say that. Because I did kind of feel like it was a bit Cantina scene-like when they go to the island. It actually has quite a bit in common with Star Wars when you think about it, because you've got this sort of isolated character who doesn't really know where he's coming from, and he wants to set out into the big wide universe to find himself, and
and he just so happens to be the son of this really horrible guy. Yeah,
exactly.
Sure,
yeah,
works.
Yeah. There's a surprising amount of commonalities again.
It's funny, even though the masseuse, the blind masseuse, who is another kind of stock character of the blind masseuses were common in Japan, but also is going to be, when we talk about Moju the Blind Beast next week, we're going to talk about that. But she's describing the father's hands as being webbed, and I see the father, and I see him over and over again in this movie, and it isn't until towards the end of the movie where I'm like, oh, look at his hands. It's like, I don't know why I'm so captivated by his hair and by his movements that I didn't even notice that his hands are fucked up.
I didn't either. I mean, until the end, like you said, until the end, I totally was not, because everything else is so interesting. His hair, his face, what he's doing the whole time. It's the hands are the least interesting part of what's happening in his just general aura.
And he's got that amazing voice, too. He sounds like Lord Ritsudo from the Lone Wolf and Cub movies. He's got that real, like, voice to him.
In the flashback sequence where you find out Jogoro's sort of, origin story, you do see his hands, and they are, other than having webbing, they are normal. So when he is on the island, his hands are caked in this kind of white plaster. So that's clearly some sort of affectation that he has put on to hide his deformity. But the voiceover, he is quite often out of sync, which again is like one of those. It makes perfect sense when you find out, as I said earlier, about Ishii's tendency to shoot quick, that he was quite happy to go back and fix things with ADR and such. And so I think that there's quite a bit of ADR on Jogoro. But again, with the Artivus thing, it doesn't take away from it. Like, if you notice that they're out of sync, because it just makes him seem even more otherworldly. And disconnected from what's happening.
And I wonder, too, if it was helping the performance, because he is a dancer. He's not an actor.
Yeah, he appeared in a number of films for Ishii, and there's a couple of experimental films that he was involved in. But no, he definitely was. This is, I think, his only sort of lead-esque role. Yeah,
a lead role, but who really doesn't even show up until like 50 minutes into this movie when they finally go to the island. I mean, the island has been looming large. I mean, it's there in the background of so many of the shots, and it's just like, okay, when are they going to finally get to the island? And when they do, to your point from earlier, it does not disappoint, because it is just a feast for all the senses. It is just amazing to see just the insanity that happens here. I mean, the women that are all painted silver, the guy who's spinning the torches and everything, just one thing after another. And in the story, I like it that it's this whole idea, they call it Panorama Island because of this, like an old time type of thing called a panorama, where you would go into a room and it would seem like the room was much wider, longer than it was. They would do a lot of recreations of battles, and it was this whole thing. It was kind of reminds me of this thing I went to when I was in Georgia once, but that's where the stage kind of spins around and you're in the center. And this one, it's more you walk in and everything is around you. The idea of what he does is he's creating this island, which is all of these different areas where you walk in and it feels like you're walking for miles, but it's actually only just a few feet, that he's using optical illusions in order to trick your eyes and trick your mind. That's why it costs so darn much money. It isn't because he's making freaks. It's because of all of these optics that he has to create on the island.
Yeah, interesting resonances, because Tatsumi Hijikata, one of the films that he was involved in, I can't remember the name of it, but it was the only ever film produced in Astrorama, I think it was called. I think they talked about it in the Arrow video booklet, and it was like 5 interlocked 70mm projectors. And so it was Tatsumi Hijikata projected on like just the biggest, bigger than IMAX. And apparently wherever I read it, they said it's to this day, it's still the largest projection ever in history of film. That connects with that, obviously, but also connects that Ranpo did write on cinema. And he wrote that it terrified him, that he didn't like it, that he thought it was incredibly unnatural, that it was being thrust into Gulliver's Travels, and you were suddenly made to be this, small person in this land of giants with these monstrous faces towering over you beyond any kind of normalcy. Yeah, there's just so much with this film and the connections to it that just overlaps in such fascinating ways. Oh, man, like I said, rabbit holes. I can't even remember half of where I was reading anything from, because I was just going sideways into this and sideways into that. It's such there's just so many fascinating interconnections with Ishii in general. There was the other thing with, this is 69, and, you're doing your month of 69, that how much he really nailed the sense of a cult and a cult leader as well. And when I was only in the last couple of weeks that I found out that Ishii had made Japanese Hell Jikoku, which depicted Shunriko and Kashihara, their leader, being the group that committed the sarin gas attacks in Tokyo subway in the 90s. And that blew me away because Jogoro is very similar to Kashihara.
Picture I remember of him is with that huge beard, right?
Yeah, and the sort of the ideology of it as well, and the kind of madness of it. But obviously also 69, you've got Charles Manson. There's a real Manson vibe going on here. But also Jonestown. Like, I had such Jonestown vibes from the kind of the island and the way that they were operating and his kind of cult-like leadership. It's a pretty consistent theme through the Ishii films I've seen of working around ideas of tyranny and tyrannical figures and the kind of monstrosity that comes from tyranny. And quite often the characters, and not just in Ishii's films, but also in Ranpo's works, that these tyrannical figures grow from victimization, much like we were talking about earlier, in like the incel kind of thing, the idea that they are victimized and that turns them into monsters. And I was thinking about that a lot because, we brought it up at the beginning that this was essentially banned and not presented much because of its issues relating to the title Malformed Men and, taboos relating to that in Japanese culture and worldwide. And, you look at something like Blind Beast and, and the blind person as a killer and Killer Dwarf, where you've got a dwarf person as a killer. And generally, like in the West, we've become very sensitive to these representations of people who are, quotation marks, other, as being monstrous and, a danger to us. And, it feels a little bit like splitting hairs. But as I dug into more of his films and I looked at all this stuff, the monstrosity isn't their physicality. It's nothing, their abnormality, their difference, their disability isn't what makes them monstrous. It's the way society reacts to that is what makes them into what they are. They feel that they are ostracized, that they haven't been given the opportunities that they should have, or that somebody outright just didn't care for them. I mean, in the beginning of Japanese Hell, because that was a film that was sort of patched together from a couple of different films that he was trying to make. We have a couple of scenes of a young man who is killing little girls, and one of the little girls sees his hands and goes, "Oh, what is wrong with your hands?" And you don't really see like what's wrong with them. He just says that they're paralyzed, partially paralyzed. And the character, this serial killer says in voiceover, you hear him thinking, "Oh, my parents, they didn't do anything about this. They didn't have the operation done to fix it." And so again, we have this connection to parents failing to help their children or, victimizing their children or leading their children to feel like they're victimized by their parents. And it's really consistent through quite a bit of it. And in Blind Beast vs. Killer Dwarf as well, it's like he says that it wasn't until he was victimized after joining the circus that he decided he would only live for himself and screw all other people. It's very important to be aware of that when you're watching it, that Ishii isn't dehumanizing people. He's dealing with characters who dehumanize people.
I wonder if the circus theme comes from Ranpo or if that comes more from Ishii.
To the circus point and to your point about, tyranny and victimizing people, there's a lot of obviously Edgar Allan Poe influences here through Ranpo, being a huge fan. I see a lot of Corman influence through some of this, just as far as I think a lot of the stuff like the, stuff on the cliffs and with the ocean waves hitting, a lot of sort of towards the end where we get the screens going green or blue, remind me a lot of Mask of the Red Death in particular. And I mean that there with when we get into Prospero's castle there and we see him being like, "Sure, you can stay in my castle away from the plague, but in order to do that, you basically have to do whatever I want you to do, and I'll humiliate you. I'll make you act like an animal. I'll make you, dress up in these costumes and do these weird things, all for my amusement." And basically, you get to live. Now, your life isn't great, but you're alive, so be grateful for it, I guess. And I get there was a lot of that coming through to me on this. And I think a lot of that, again, there's that cult aspect where it's just this collection of people that, for whatever reason, are sticking together, be it because they don't have anywhere to go, they don't have any confidence in themselves, they don't have the ability or means to do anything for themselves, so they stay. And I think that, having the main character, he does stay for a while. I mean, he is told, you're going to stay here for a few months and you're going to, basically for the rest of your life, and you're going to be my doctor. And then he's not really trained, but he does some operation anyway, and it turns out fine. And I think that, I liked seeing the sort of Edgar Allan Poe meets Corman meets Japanese influence all sort of converging into this one piece.
Of the Ishii films I've seen, this is definitely his Corman Poe-esque AIP film. He was definitely one of much like the Italian directors. Again, he reminded me of Deodato, that of the films I've seen, he tended to make films that directly borrowed influences from the West. That, like I said, that his noirs reminded me very much of Jules Dassin. That Ishii's first big hit was Abashiri Prison, which was directly inspired by The Defiant Ones, essentially kind of Japanese remake of that, and became a huge hit. I revisited Female Yakuza Tale after watching Horrors of Malformed Men again, and that you watch that and you're like, oh, this is his spaghetti western. Like it's so western, spaghetti western influenced. And so he was very comfortable in switching between these kind of, these different, taking his specific interests and applying various genres to them and doing it very, very successfully, much in the way that the Italian directors did. And actually, I'd say possibly like far more successfully than the Italian directors, because you tended to get, a lot of the Italian directors didn't switch so successfully between different genres. Like Margheriti was very much a specialist in Gothics, and Lenzi was a bit more the, crazy horror action and et cetera, et cetera. Castellari more the Macaroni War and westerns and such. Whereas, Ishii could really switch between styles quite comfortably and pull it off very successfully.
And you're right as far as the El Topo thing goes, too. I mean, I forget about El Topo being a movie very much of two halves, very much like this one, because with that, we have, after the gunfighter version of El Topo, then we have the freak version of El Topo and him there with the freaks in the whole western town, and again the cult and the whole all-seeing eye and the games of Russian roulette and all that. But the idea of El Topo coming up from the underground with all of these fellow freaks is very similar to this idea of going to this freak island. But here, like El Topo, I don't think he was manipulating the freaks like I know that I'm using a really horrible word of freaks, but that's the best way to describe the folks that are in this, especially the rice man and the goat people. He's not using them. He's one of them. And in this one, it feels like the father is more using them and he's more amused by the freaks.
I think that says a lot about the difference between the two cultures at the time, because, the 60s counterculture very much embraced the word freak. And it became part of the movement and became way to identify as not being the man, whereas in the East that never happened. It just, there was no positive association with the word, and so instead they're just another group to be victimized, and that is something that is very consistent in Ishii's work is abuse and victimization. And also, I can't remember if it was Flesh Pier or Female Yakuza Tale, or maybe even both. I think it was Flesh Pier, has asylums being used as a place to illegally lock people up to get rid of them and shift them into slavery. which we find out is that the women at the beginning in the prison are all these women who are lured in with a job who are then going to be sent off to the island. And so even that's fascinating that what is meant to be a place of care and healing, theoretically, definitely not at that time or for most of history, is actually just another trap, is just another place to be further abused and destroyed. And actually, we mentioned how they did this torture cycle, but there really are quite a few of them, punishment is a consistent theme. Their punishment recurs through so many of his films. You got, Inferno of Torture and Shogun's Joy of Torture, and this was very much, these cycles. When you look into Japanese cinema at that time, again, it's much like the Italians, where they would go through the cycles, like the Peplums and the Gothics and the Polizei's and things like that, and they would have their cycles, the Yakuza films and their torture films and their the Kaiden films and all those kind of things. But because last week you were doing Venus in Furs, it wasn't just in Japan that there was this sort of explosion of interest in torture cinema, because there's like Mark of the Devil. There's lots of, the Spanish Inquisition kind of film, Witchfinder General. I haven't watched it yet, but, 88 Films just put out, was it Beatrice Cenci, the Lucio Fulci's film, which deals directly with torture and religion.
Well, and a lot of the Nazi-exploitation films dealt with that as well. I mean, you think about Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, or like the Gestapo's Last Orgy. Some of those movies, they just feel like they're kindred spirits to some of these Joy of Torture films. Yeah,
and I think that from some of the readings I got the sense that the latter films, Ishii's latter torture films, while they were still pretty negatively regarded, they were very successful, and they were allowed more because they dealt with historical instances of torture. And so whereas Horrors of Malformed Men is fantastical and so ungrounded, and there's not really a justification. So it's almost like that this exploitation thing of mum and dad films, where it's like, oh no, this is educational because you're learning about history. This is how they tortured people 200 years ago.
It's all fact-based, I'm sure, right?
We'll take the whole class along to see it. Which actually, that reminds me, I
whole
grew
class Nazi exploitation.
I grew up in a country town with a large population of born-again Christians, and they showed them Mark of the Devil, the Udo Kier film.
God.
They showed as a way to be like, this is what Satan does, and this is evil, and everything. They're like, you're showing like 12 to 16-year-olds this film, which it was probably banned in Australia and was banned in many countries just because it's a representation of evil. Okay, cool, sure. Can I borrow your copy?
Yeah, and we do have to talk about the end of this film with this whole Oedipal thing that's going on here, because that has come up a couple times this month, actually, as we're talking about Porcile and now this film and just a few others that, I'm always looking for Oedipal themes in films, and this one, it just is right there on the surface as far as him rescuing this girl from being part of a Siamese twin where they're just basically bound together by some cloth, it looks like.
Yeah, that's why he's so good at surgery. He just had to clip the cloth and it's fine.
And going and meeting his mother in the cave and just there's just so many Freudian things that are happening in this movie as well. But yeah, that he ends up finding out that his sister is part of this this whole thing, and that his mother's there on the island, and that she had slept with this other guy. I mean, it just goes on, and you're right, it's just this wonderful exposition dump, and that's also where we get it's almost like that parlor scene in a mystery novel, but this one's taking place in a cave around a corpse. Where our detective reveals himself and manages to unravel everything.
Yeah, it's sort of like a cask of Amontillado meets And Then There Were None. When it gets to the island, it's like that it is episodic, and you do have a bit of trouble following, okay, what's the timeline here? But it is quite linear for the most part, and it does keep along a forward progression. He's on the train journey. You're on the journey with him. And then the sensation I get, I think I must have seen this about 4 or 5 times now, is like you get to the island and suddenly the film turns into a balloon that is just filling up with blood. And it's just like, it just keeps filling up, and you're like holding this thing in your hands going, how much bigger is this gonna get? Until it literally explodes in the last 5 minutes. And it's such a weird way to like sense a film, but that's the sense that I get. Like you watch it and it does weigh itself down. Like but it doesn't grind to a halt. It does this such a strange thing in that it just bloats out suddenly in the last part with this exposition and all this flashbacks and all this extra detail. But you're so on tenterhooks being like, after everything else that has happened, what could possibly happen next? And, only one of the greatest finales in cinema, I will happily say right now.
I would have to agree.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, you have to, and anyone out there listening, if you get a chance to see this with a group of people who have not watched it, do it. Do it as soon as possible. Get a group of people over who haven't watched it and just make them watch it, because it is. I've done it twice with a crowd that had no idea what was coming, and the way that this film just throws them around in that last half an hour and then just slaps them down at the end. Oh, the reaction of audiences is amazing. I know that Mark Schilling talks about that. There's a screening in Italy that there was a 10-minute standing ovation at the end. And it's like, I 100% believe that. I would not be surprised, because this film once the fireworks start going off and the body parts start flying and everything's just like, yeah, okay, sure. That seems the only way to finish this film. And none of those are euphemisms for the people who haven't seen it. The fireworks literally fly along with the body parts.
Which, again, I mean, that is so true to the ending of the actual Ranpo story, though it's just our main character. And I love this whole idea of him becoming this human firework, and that people don't even realize what's going on until they look and they're covered with his blood, that it's just become this mist of blood that covers the island. It's just like, wow, what a way to go out. Yeah, and I was so happy the detective, when he finally reveals himself and just starts to lay this whole thing out, because we've already had the husband, the father, lay all of these things out, and then it's basically like, here's one exposition dump, and now here's the detective to give us even more, and it just goes on and on and on. I mean, yeah, I think that probably the last 20 minutes of this film is a flashback to previous things that have happened. Just amazing.
Yeah, and I love the way he uses color tinting as well. That different flashbacks have different color tintings, but then within flashbacks, people do interject, and it does shift tints when they interject. At least one point, I think, and then there's like daytime, nighttime tinting, and it's just like all the way that you can just see Ishii's just like, again, that playfulness of like, oh no, we can do more with this. We can do more with this. Just chuck in more. They'll do this, do that, and it's just like, yes. When you watch like an independent, no budget film, and they're just like, it's boring, and you're just like, you can do stuff. You can do anything. You can do so much with cinema, even with no money. Just a simple touch like that can just alter how you're engaging with the film and how your whole like senses are pressing up against it. And this film never lets off, and never, even when it does suddenly bloat and sort of grind to a halt, it's still kind of rubbing up against you, going, yeah, you like this.
It really reminds me of like Emperor Tomato Ketchup in the way that Terayama would use the tinting of the black and white. Because I'm curious if I imagine that all of these things that he's showing us that are tinted were shot in black and white and then tinted afterwards, rather than some sort of color treatment of this. That seems like that'd be the smartest way to go.
I would think so, and it kind of looks like that was the fact, like that. It just looks like something that was added in post, and given what you said previously about how fast he, was keen on making these movies, I think it was probably something he just wanted to add in after the fact.
Yeah, well, there is one little odd moment where they talk about the circus, and it cuts to the interior of the circus and it's black and white, and it's definitely stock footage, because you can see that even on the restoration there's damage, and it's definitely stock footage. But I love that kind of, it feeds into a sense of nostalgia. that it's like, it sort of messes with your timeline. It's like, oh, your brain goes, I should be reading this as a flashback, but it's occurring right now. But then that idea of the circus doesn't really exist anymore. Even, heading towards that period, it didn't really. So it gives you this sense of like you're almost in his mind as he thinks circus, and you get those flashes of images of this is what a circus means, and that black and white adds to that kind of nostalgic feel with the bit of grain and the damage to the print.
Well, it's smart too that the one son that was supposed to be the doctor, I think he was given to someone to take care of him who was in the circus. So this whole idea of the sideshows and all those things really play into this as well. So he would have been exposed to real quote unquote freaks in the circus, and then having that as your background going into medical school, and then coming out, if your father got his wish, and being able to make freaks on the island, he would have something to draw upon.
Yeah, and on a meta level, the idea of the carnivalesque as well plays into the whole ero-guro genre of being a space where you can go and let go of all your, traditional borders and boundaries and engage with taboos and be someone else and do different things, and then, return to the normal world after leaving the carnival. So there's definitely that aspect as well. When I watched Flesh Pier, Flesh Pier was about sex trafficking. And there's a great quote from one of the sex traffickers. There was, once a woman goes strange, anything can happen. I was like, oh, that's such a great line. And I feel like Ishii's like, it's, it's in Flesh Pier, it's a bad character referring to a woman, but I feel like Ishii is just like, once a human goes strange, anything can happen. And that's the ethos of his entire filmography.
All right, guys, we're going to take a break, and we'll be right back right after these brief messages.
Do you like great music? Do you like in-depth podcasts? Do you like the idea of putting great music under the microscope? If you answered yes, no, or fish to any of these questions, Love That Album is the show for you. Every month, Morris and a fellow music fanatic discuss a particular album in detail. They'll cover the performer, the history behind the recording, the musicianship, common thematic elements between the songs, and how many drugs were consumed during its creation. Well, maybe not so much of the last bit. So, if you want to hear a podcast bringing perspective to great rock, jazz, folk, punk, and sea shanty music, then subscribe to Love That Album podcast at Apple Podcasts, or download directly from lovethatalbum.blogspot.com.
You guys look like... What do they look like, Jimmy?
Dorks. They look like a couple of dorks.
If you're looking for dorky, geek-filled content where you can nerd out over movies, television, comic books, and so much more, then you've come to the right place. The In the Mouth of Dorkness podcast is bringing geek-related content to you 3 times a week.
Hey everyone, I'm the Turtle Dork here at Mod. On Mondays, we drop our Weekend Dork episode, which is a recap of sorts, where we discuss the most pertinent geek-related things we did in the previous week.
Hi, I'm Wife Dork, and on Wednesdays, we drop our Homework Cast episode. Each week, the dorks take turns choosing a movie for the month's chosen dork to watch and review, like Heat, or Star Trek II, or Green Room.
Howdy, I am the Mouth Dork, and finally, on everyone's favorite day of the week, we drop our Fistful Friday episode. Each Fistful episode is basically a top 5 list related to movies, comics, or some other geek-related topic. Because we all know at the end of the week, we need a little fist of Xander Cage.
Hey, and I'm the Disco Dork. In addition to our regularly scheduled programming, we have special guests, film festival and comic convention coverage, interview episodes, and more. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, and other podcast platforms. Just search In the Mouth of Dorkness or It Modcast, where we are for the promotion and progression of geek culture.
it's not easy having a good time. And it's not cheap either. Every week, the projection booth brings you a new show, possibly even two, focusing on all genres of cinema. If you've sat through the 7-hour Conan episode, the 6-hour Star Wars episode, or even the hour-long Superbman episode, you know that Mike and his co-host put forth a lot of work into researching the movies, tracking down the interview subjects, and putting together one of the best podcasts on the internet. Now I'm asking you if you can repay all that hard work by giving back to the projection booth. The show has a Patreon fundraiser at Patreon. That's patreon.com/projection booth. You can donate as little as $1 a month. That's $12 a year. At least 50 great shows and 2 terrible ones. That's the price of 2 matinee tickets. Now isn't the projection booth worth it? Once again, that's patreon.com/projection booth. Donate today. It's the right thing to do.
I have been a surfer since even before I can remember. When I hit the water, it felt like a giant had grabbed me and slammed me to the bottom. Never knew there was such a fear.
Surfer, Teen Confronts Fear is a movie of faith, fear, and redemption that has mesmerized audiences around the globe. Now playing at the Film Bar Theater in Phoenix, Arizona. Tickets on sale now at thefilmbarphx.com.
I'm Chris Cooling from Forgotten TV, and you're listening to The Projection Booth, the ultimate movie podcast.
All right, we are back, and we were talking about Horrors of Malformed Men. It took me a little while to track this one down, but many years later, I want to say it was his last film that Ishii actually returned to the Ranpo well and ended up making a movie called, I've read different titles, but Blind Beast versus Dwarf seems to be the one that sticks. And that was another mashup of more Ranpo stuff. And at first, I was really turned off by the movie because it looks like it was shot on a camcorder. But then as the film goes on, I managed to get really involved with it, even though it does look incredibly cheap at times.
I really liked this one. I didn't like it as much as Jigoku. Jigoku, completely, oh my god, I'm going to make so many people watch Jigoku in the next 6 months. But Blind Beast versus Dwarf or Killer Dwarf, yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I think it's more enjoyable if you come at it from the Ishii perspective than from a general horror DV, straight to video kind of perspective. Because I can definitely see how if you just chucked it on, it has a lot of things that kind of reminded me of Ed Wood, where he's just, quick, we've got some film, let's just shoot something. But if you're watching it from that Ishii perspective, and you've seen a couple of Japanese Hell, and you've seen, Horrors of Malformed Men and such, that you can see this as him doing. Well, it made me want to go and watch Sion Sono's Why Don't You Play in Hell? Because I feel like Blind Beast versus Killer Dwarf is basically the film that they make in Why Don't You Play in Hell? And it's just who have we got? Let's just fill this. We've got that person. We've got this person. You got the director of Tetsuo. Quick, get him in there. It's just let's go crazy. Let's spray some blood around. Let's just make the sets out of paper mache. It's who gives a fuck? Let's just go for it and just make something on the streets and that feels live. And it's it's a terrible film, and it doesn't matter one iota, because it is exactly, you feel like they got exactly what they wanted out of it, with a no budget, with student actors and filmmakers, and it's just it's trash. It's total trash. But it's come on, he's 70 years old and he pulls off this. I've seen far, far, far worse films by skilled, quotation marks, skilled, budgeted filmmakers.
Yeah, from what I understand, he was teaching a class, and this was his students that were making this. And it's funny, there's that extra on the Blu-ray where you see his students, and I love The two kids, the one who's dropping leaves and the other one who's just got a board fanning it and stuff. It does look so incredibly cheap. A lot of it reminded me almost of like, what was that one cut of The Dead or whatever? Just that level of horror filmmaking that's inside of the movie, inside of there. But yeah, like I said, after a while I was drawn into it and I was like, okay, this movie looks like it cost $20, but I'm invested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was one of the other iconoclastic figures from the 60s that Ishii reminds me of is Coffin Joe. And this one especially because the way that when they recreate the blind beast's sculpture warehouse of arms and things looked a lot like the Vision of Hell from Coffin Joe's second film, which I can never remember the title of, which represents hell as this frozen landscape with all these arms and legs jutting out of the ice, and it looks almost exactly like that. And it's especially I watched it immediately after watching Japanese Hell, which does literally represent hell. They made a great double together. Like, they just felt like this kind of weird, icky, like, this feels like something that you might find a micro SD card on the side of the street and go home and put it in and be like, did people die?
Yeah, it's got like guinea pig level special effects, At midnight, I'll take your soul.
Corpse is the one with the vision. At midnight, I will take your soul is the first one. And This Night I Will Possess Your Corpse is the second one, right, which has the representation of hell.
They just sound so damn similar. It's crazy.
Did you get a chance to watch this one, Jess?
I unfortunately did not. I'm looking forward to it too, and I am looking forward to Japanese Hell too. That was another one that I was really, once I started looking into his filmography, that was one that went straight to the top of the list.
Oh man, I'm so glad. There is a copy can be found out there with English subtitles.
All right, perfect.
But I did them as a double, and I'm really glad I did because you can see like the drop in quality is significant. Like Blind Beast versus Killer Dwarf makes Japanese Hell look like it had a massive budget. As a sort of pairing of his last two, like they don't, it doesn't feel like a culmination. It doesn't feel like he's necessarily trying to readdress things or make a point. But if you know all these things that we've talked about, like that playfulness and that obsession with cinema, but also that obsession with tyranny and the fact that he had made a film that kind of predicted a lot of these cults that would come about in the next 40 years, that watching these two together just feels like a really fascinating look at Japanese culture and cinema culture at the turn of the century. And they're just great. I'm going to say, like, spent 20 years banging on about Kinji Fukasaku and Battle Royale, and like I love Battle Royale, but as far as like very elderly Japanese directors making insane films in 1999, I am so much more behind Jigoku now than I am behind Battle Royale. And I don't just mean that because Jigoku is fucked. I mean it because it's actually like I was looking at a letterbox and somebody described it as being like like play school. I don't know if that probably doesn't mean anything to you guys, but like it's like Sesame, not quite Sesame Street, but like parts of Jigoku feel like a kid's afternoon television program of like, how can we make representations of hell with what we've got at home with Play-Doh and things like that, and then hacking off limbs and ripping off their chest to expose their hearts beating and all this kind of stuff, but with this kind of like weirdly like, yay, we're making stuff kind of vibe. And then just like layers in the Hellraiser soundtrack out of nowhere, which again is just like we were saying before when you mentioned about playing Star Wars over the horrors of Malformed Men. Well then, 40 years later he did that himself, 30 years later he did that himself, and just was like, Hellraiser soundtrack, that works. And it does. It just like, it piles in and adds to that weird icky feel. And these two are just like, yeah, these are fine. I'm happy.
Have you seen the 1960 version of Jigoku?
I haven't.
That was Nobuo Nakagawa, I think, and that one feels closer to the level of the Coffin Joe stuff to me, because I think it was 4 years before or 5 years before, but it's nuts as well. I highly recommend that. They try to do more with a plot in that one than the Ishii one.
There isn't much of a plot in the Ishii one, but it's actually quite surprising how true to the Shinriko this story it is. He doesn't try to, and again, I think even though he's working in exploitation, Ishii doesn't feel exploitative. And when you're dealing with Shinriko, it could have been really easy to make that super exploitative. And look, I say this knowing that there's somebody out there going, "Are you fucking kidding me? There is so much rape and abuse and murder in that film." And I was like, I know I watch terrible films all the time and I'm dead inside and I forget that these films are fucked. But the way that he presents it, it does, it feels like there is a point behind it all, and it's to show
there's no maliciousness behind it.
No,
and that's sort of the feeling that exploitation had its heyday and run in the late 60s, 70s with things like Nazi exploitation and unexploitation and non-exploitation and all the all the other exploitations. And some of them felt really malicious and awful and mean-spirited, but a lot of them didn't. A lot of them, yes, they have horrible, horrible imagery and horrible acts being done, but like we talked about with Malformed Men, which is, probably, I would say, one of your more less exploitation movies, just as far as violence goes and visuals go. But there's something to be said. There's something behind that exploitation. There's a theme behind it. There's, intention behind it, rather than, I think, like Mike, you said that at first when you were started watching that movie, you didn't want to watch it because you felt it looked like it was filmed on a camcorder. And I know exactly, the second you said that, I know exactly what you mean, because I think a lot of the exploitation films that came out post-90s, post-2000s, kind of got rid of all of that, any kind of theming and messaging and reasoning behind their exploitation, and they just made, films like the guinea pig films, which I'm not a fan of, that just feel mean-spirited and ugly and dirty just to be that way. And I think that they sort of miss the point of exploitation as a genre. But yeah, I don't know. I think that there's something to be said about that kind of exploitation from the 70s that does have a lot of staying power and sticking power, because there's still something behind it. It's not all about the exploitation.
Yeah, that's why I was curious because I feel like Horrors of Malformed Men is one of those films that I'm like, oh yeah, it's not actually that messed up, and then somebody normal watches and goes, "What the hell is wrong with you?
What the fuck are you talking about?" Yeah. Yeah, because I'm like, this kind of has a Houseu quality of it, where it's a little bit, absurd and surreal and fun, and normal people be like, what is fun about this at all?
Exactly. And so that's why I immediately chucked on Female Yakuza Tale to get a bit of sort of contrast. And that is super way more nasty in its violence, both sexual and other, regular, whatever. I don't know what the word would be. If it's just general violence, Female Yakuza Tale is a lot more nasty and messed up.
Palatable.
But it's well, no, I think that to me that's the film that I more go like, oh, that's the film that's messed up, because it's more things that are like abuse and of very, there's stuff in Female Yakuza Tale which will have you go, whoa. There's to do with drug smuggling and where they hide the drugs in women and how they test how much they can hide in women. That made me go, my eyes are watering right now. Yeah, and it's written by the same co-writer as Horrors of Malformed Men. A lot of other. He also did School of the Holy Beast as well. And so then watching that, I was like, okay, so is it just that there's only about 4 years difference between the two? And I couldn't tell if it was did that 4 years, because it was, the 60s and 70s was a highly accelerated period when it came to permissiveness in relation to sex and violence on screen. And so it was was that 4 years enough time for them to go like, oh, well, we can do this now? Or was it that Ishii knew that malformed men didn't need that and that it would tip it too much? Whereas Female Yakuza Tale, having a female protagonist, being quite a feminist film, borrowing from spaghetti westerns, which are already quite hyper stylized in their violence, that meant that he was more willing to go to those places. And so following that up, I was like, okay, I'll chuck on another film for contrast. And I'd had sitting here for ages, Hanzo the Razor, Sword of Justice.
Oh.
And so I chucked that on afterwards, and then I was just like, yuck. Yuck. And for those who don't know, Hanzo the Razor is a detective film in which the detective is very moral and hates corruption and is all about doing good, except that he rapes women constantly in order to interrogate them and get information from them. And of course, all the women love it by the end of it because his penis is so big and blah, blah, blah. And I just watched it and just being like, you could just feel it immediately. Like, it just, the difference in style and tone. And it was like, no, this is trash. Like, this is yuck. This feels abusive and destructive and meaningless. And it was like, it was such a fascinating triple to do, because even though Ishii was going into places which would be considered far more taboo by a lot of people and cultures, as soon as you got to Hanzo the Razor, it was like, you could just feel it immediately, that difference in tone and everything. And it was like, no, Ishii was a weird one. And even when, Blind Beast versus Killer Dwarf and stuff, when the violence comes in it, it's actually quite shocking, because they're quite restrained for the most part. And I almost didn't think that he was going to go there. And it does sort of save it up and use it appropriately, instead of just like, as you were saying, Jess, these films that just kind of do away with the meaning and just splash blood and gore everywhere. And I was like, even at the end, he was still like able to have that kind of hold and control. And that's what game where I come back to like wondering what he was reading, the kind of like what subject matters were of interest to him, because I think that just like a Jodorowsky and Lynch and all these other iconic figures that we're talking about. And I mean, like, you look at Coffin Joe, when Coffin Joe came back and had made Embodiment of Evil, 15 years ago. And that film just is gross and nasty and not particularly enjoyable. And it is exactly that. There's no meaning behind it. It's just like, oh, how fucking nasty can we be? And Ishii, even though he is tackling one of the most horrific groups in Japanese history and all this horrific stuff in Japanese hell and all of this nightmarish things in Blind Beast vs. Killer Dwarf, it's still, it feels like he does actually have a purpose to it, and that there is that sense of, again, like the Grand Guignol, where there's a sense of fun to it, that it's like, we want to push your buttons, but we want you to be wanting us to push your buttons. That's actually something really hard to pull off, and pretty rare. So yeah, I for one, I'm definitely, please, world, release more Ishii films. We need more Ishii.
What is that? Is that just rights issues? Is that, because I mean, you would think Synapse or Code Red or Scream Factory, I mean, any of the Vinegar Syndrome.
Well, Arrow's done 2 in the last 2 years with Orgies of Edo and Malformed Men. And they did, one of their first batch was Blind Woman's Curse, which unfortunately is now well out of print. I know here in Australia, Female Yakuza Tale, and it's actually the sequel to Sex and Fury. They were released on DVD, so they were available fairly readily, like 10 years ago. But beyond that, it's just one of those things where he's just not really considered. I think it's a bit like Georges Franju, director of Eyes Without a Face, where it's very like almost impossible to calculate how significant a director they are and how important and how much they helped shift and alter their own industries. But they worked in a particular style and strand of cinema that just caused everyone to be like, we don't want to talk about that. And I think that's basically all it comes down to, that it is that a bit of a cultural cringe, that it's like it's taken, a long time for France to come around to being like, oh, yeah, maybe Franju was all right, as opposed to being one of the most important filmmakers of the 20th century. Because, I remember reading about that there were, encyclopedia French books that were encyclopedias of films that would either not mention Georges Franju at all or would only mention him in passing. And it's like, no, Eyes Without a Face is equally as important as Psycho for that massive shift that happens in horror in 59-60. So many of his films are just unbelievably beautifully constructed and so important. And I think Ishii's the same, that he did work in low genres, that he didn't, cross over to make his, Kurosawa kind of things. He started off making these trashy sci-fi films. He made trashy prison films. He made trashy Yakuza films. He made trashy torture films. And it's like, just, when you think of someone like Bava, who was written off for so long as well, of just being a exploitative horror filmmaker and trashy filmmaker, and it's taken until, the last 10, 15 years before we're like, oh no, wait a minute, he's one of the greats. He's like up there in the pantheon, and it can be screened at, Cinematheque style things alongside, Fellini and such, without people going, what the... And I think that Japan has just taken so much longer to get to that point. Because I know in reading about the shunga erotic art, that basically that wasn't really, it was still kind of looked down on and kept under wraps until only like the last 30 years. And it's only in the last 30 years that this, absolutely one of the most significant art forms in Japanese culture, because as you can see, like the shunga underlies like, ero-guro and hentai and all these other forms that are really dominant in a lot of the culture. It's only in the last 30 years that they've started to talk about it academically and start to, present them in museums and to release books about them and go, these are important, even though they are deviant or obscene or whatever, they're important. And I think Ishii is that kind of thing where it's like he's way down the list as far as Japanese culture goes. They're still the people who are the gatekeepers of Japanese culture, I think, are still, they're still too busy discovering, whoever made whatever theatrical. I don't want to slag off art films. I'm just really bored of art films from the 60s and 70s lately. They're great. The Japanese cinema of the 60s and 70s is amazing across the board. But when you get someone like Ishii, and then you've got the that they just didn't have that breakout. It's something like Horrors of Malformed Men. If it had an international release, I do think he would be a lot more well known. But it just didn't happen, and he was he was very successful at home. He's Abasari Prison was a massive hit that spawned. He made like I think 10 of those films, and the series kept going. And I can't remember who's the lead actor in that. He went on to an international career, and that film started Ken Takakura. Yeah, and so he was in Black Rain, Yakuza. Oh, Mr. Baseball with Tom Selleck. Who could forget? There's really the only reason for it is that he just was an actual legitimate outsider weirdo who made legitimate outsider weirdo films. And of course, those people were often the most influential, but often the most ignored until long, long, long later.
I love Shuji Terayama, and I think maybe Fruits of Paradise is available readily, but nothing else. I mean, even the boxing movie that he made, which would be pretty, it was the most unusual movie for him compared to Throw Away Your Books and March Out in the Streets or whatever that was called, or Emperor Tomato Ketchup. I mean, those things will probably never get a real legit release. And there's just so many filmmakers from Japan where it's just like, okay, that's great. I love Kurosawa. That's fantastic. But can I see some more Wakamatsu or, any of the other ATG filmmakers? I really want to see more of these guys and more off the wall exploitation stuff.
Yeah, well, I'd forgotten about I was actually thinking a lot about Wakamatsu while watching these, especially the one he made that was based on the Richard Speck killings, because that's an interesting connection as well with the Shinriko of using true crime to look at that Japanese culture and examine sort of, the toxic ideology.
He even made a Ranpo adaptation, Caterpillar.
Oh, I haven't come across that one.
All right, guys, we're going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
めくらの世界に残されているたった一つの楽しみ。それは触覚です。中でも女の体の手触りが一番です。温かくて柔らかくて。
この子の見張りは私が引き受けるよ。だから安心してアトリエでいい彫刻をこしらえなさい。
お前は俺のものだ。女にしてやる。俺の女になれ。誰があったのかの。死んでやる。知らせてたまるか。お前のおかげで男になれるんだ。思いっきり抱いてやる。楽しんでやる。
ところが私は次第に彼を愛するようになってしまったのです。そして痛ければ痛いほど、苦しければ苦しいほど喜びを感じるようになったのです。ダメ、もっと噛んでちょうだい。
That's right. We'll be back next week with a look at another Edogawa Ranpo adaptation, The Blind Beast. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Jess and Ben. So, Ben, what has been keeping you busy lately?
Not a whole lot. I've been working on doing some post-production work on a Netflix series that's coming up called Clickbait, which should be dropping sometime towards the end of the year and looks pretty interesting. It's the first Netflix production that's made in Australia. They've done a couple of series that they've helped produce, but this is the first one where it's like Netflix has turned up with the people and the money and all that kind of thing. And it's a international co-production with, cast from all over the world and directors and such. And yeah, that should be an interesting one to check out. I can't say much more than that because, super secretive Netflix. But yeah, no, other than that, that's the main thing that's been keeping me pretty busy lately. I've just been possible couple of little festival things on the horizon, but at this stage, just trying to find clean air and stay cool.
And Jess, what have you been up to?
Well, I have been co-hosting another podcast with a frequent Projection Booth co-host, Chris Stashew. It's called The One Season Show, where we tackle shows that lasted only one season. We are in the middle of Kitchen Confidential right now. I've also been on Chris's podcast quite a lot. On 2 episodes for David Lynch December, and that's the Culture Cast. So if you want to know what my thoughts on Mulholland Drive and Dune are, Mike, you were on that one, and that was a fun episode. That was a fun surprise for me. And then you can find me on Twitter at writer Jess Byard. I tweet occasionally. I put digital art up there occasionally. I don't know. I always have a million things I feel like I'm doing.
Have you covered Earth 2 yet, or are you going to cover Earth 2?
We have not covered Earth 2.
I don't even know why this has come up lately, but this is like about the whenever somebody mentions of one season only, and this is the second time in a week that I've asked someone about Earth 2.
I would totally do that. I think I've probably only seen maybe 1 or 2 episodes of that show, but yeah, I would totally be down for that.
I think that stuck with me because I feel like that was my first big television heartbreak. I think that was the first series that I remember falling in love with, and it only having 1 season despite having a cliffhanger ending. And so I think that's why it's always stuck with me. Plus it has Clancy Brown in it, so that's also another reason to love it. So.
All right, guys, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Please head on over to the website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You'll also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.